Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 10 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Los Angeles Kings and lost by a score of 4-3. And this one hurts. This is definitely a result that does hurt to see. You go back to the first game of the season when the Sharks took on the Vegas Golden Knights, and they gave up those couple of unlucky ones that tied the game and then won the game in overtime. Even that doesn't feel as bad as the result here tonight, because at the very least, at best, you could argue in that first game that the Sharks were even with Vegas, which is still impressive because the Golden Knights are a great team, but still it was kind of a 50-50 toss-up outing. But here tonight, not only were the Sharks better than the Kings, but they were dominant over Los Angeles throughout this game. Like, you go back a couple of weeks when the Sharks took on the Carolina Hurricanes and they got completely crushed to the point where it didn't even look like those two teams belonged on the same ice surface together. That was the feeling here tonight in this game. You were kind of wondering like which AHL team had just blown into town by how large the gap was between San Jose and Los Angeles. 99% of the times that you play out a game like this, the Sharks are the ones who come out on top. It is just unfortunate that this so happened to be the 1% that the Kings squeak out a victory, and not only that, a regulation victory, which means that the Sharks don't even have a singular point to hang on to. They leave their best game of the season, and in fact one of the best games that they have played in years, with 0 points. Now you can put a bit of a positive spin on this. Look on the bright side here, which is, as I said, that this was a great played game for the Sharks, and if they're able to put up efforts like this moving forward, they will win more games for sure. And I imagine this is exactly what the coaching staff is telling the team right now. The problem with that is that if the Sharks were like a top of the table, number one in the division type of organization, you'd be able to accept this very easily. If this were New Jersey or Carolina or Colorado or whichever one of these teams, they could look at a night like tonight and say, yeah, but we'll just put up more outings like this and we'll get more wins in the future. Sometimes things happen and you lose a game like this. But the problem here for the San Jose Sharks is that you look at the first 9 games of this season, and it really hasn't been all that straightforward. Even in the 2 victories that the Sharks have had, it has not come easily. There have been multiple blown leads. They've had to fight tooth and nail just to get those overtime wins. This is the type of performance that you probably don't expect to happen all that often. Like, the stars kind of aligned here that not only the Sharks played their best, but the Kings probably also played their worst. And so, as much as I'd love to believe that San Jose has suddenly flip the switch and this is the type of performance that we can get and expect from them moving forward, I'm not so confident in actually saying that. I'd love to see it, but I'm not so sure. And so the fact that this is the type of outing that we probably won't see all that often, I would have loved for the Sharks to actually be able to get that victory that they absolutely deserved. Now, this one starts off in the first period with a goal actually from Los Angeles. The first period is relatively evenly played, I would say, and it comes from Corey Perry, who even 20 years after his draft year continues to be a thorn in the side of the San Jose Sharks. This is just as a power play expires, so it is a power play influenced goal that makes it 1-0, and then it is the second period where things kind of turn on for San Jose. They are the far better team in this middle frame, and yet it's the Kings not only who strike first in the middle frame, but actually twice, as they turn a 1-0 lead into a 3-0 lead. And at this point, the Sharks are getting stonewalled by Kings goaltender Darcy Kemper, but eventually they find 2 great passes that manage to get them on the board. One comes from Celebrini, looks for Will Smith on the back door, that makes it 3-1, and then a very similar-ish looking play where it is Wenberg who finds Kurashev on the back door, that makes it 3-2. We then head into the third period. The Sharks are continuing to push, and then it is Alex Wenberg who finds a power play influenced goal of his own, because again, just as a power play expired, and that ties the game up at 3. And the Sharks, they have fought their way back from a 3-goal deficit against a pretty solid defensive Kings team, or at least they were last year, and so they can be very, very happy with themselves. But at this point, the Kings, they wake up a little bit, they find a couple chances of their own, one from Kempe where he gets robbed by Askarov, but then on this Brandt Clark shot, pretty innocent looking play, but it beats Askarov, finds the back of the net, and restores the lead for the Kings. And the Sharks, they do continue to push after this. They get some great chances, including a good 75 or so seconds at the end of the game in a 6-on-4 situation due to a power play plus the goaltender pulled, and they have their looks, but they are unable to beat Kemper again. He comes up huge for this Kings team, and they end up losing this game. The Sharks end up losing this game 4-3 in regulation. Moving on to the players to talk about, unfortunately, no Adam Gaudette here tonight. We saw him get injured in the previous game against the Minnesota Wild. We don't know exactly how long he is out, but I guess the good news for the Sharks is that now they don't really have to make so many tough decisions with their lineup. This is the 12 group of players that we should expect to see up until Gaudette is likely to return. They did, however, call up a 13th forward. That ended up being Patrick Giles. Now, this was a little bit of a surprise because despite the fact that Giles was really good at the end of last season, we really haven't gotten to see much of him in like a kind of training camp preseason situation because he was injured throughout much of it. But I imagine since the fact that the Sharks probably are looking to stay with these 12 moving forward, that they didn't want to call up a guy like Cam Lund or Ethan Cardwell to just ride the bench. And so Giles is someone who they could have be around just in case another injury does occur, but they don't feel bad having him just ride the bench here for a few games, again, depending on the length of Gaudette's injury. Now, when it comes to the players who did play here in this one, we have the top group of Toffoli, Celebrini, and Smith. Generally, all four of these lines were at a baseline quite solid, but obviously some were better than others. This line at the top did stand out in a quite positive way, and it does start with Macklin Celebrini, who I thought was just all over the puck yet again here in this game. He was forechecking hard. He was stripping pucks from players like Brandt Clark or Andrzej Kopitar, some really solid, talented players. The Kings are, at least again historically, a pretty solid defensive team, even if it hasn't quite been there thus far this season. So it is not easy to create open ice in the offensive zone for yourself, and yet Celebrini was managing to do so on a very consistent basis. He's just been having such great success ever since the start of this last road trip. He picks up the primary assist on the Will Smith goal, so he does continue his point streak, and so there's not a ton of negative to say about Celebrini, who again had a very good game. When it comes to Will Smith, I was also very impressed with him here tonight. There were a couple awkward moments when the Sharks were down by those 3 goals. It felt as though Smith trying to maybe be a little bit frustrated. He was trying to do too much and try to find that perfect play, picture perfect, that would easily be able to beat Kemper, and that quite wasn't working out. But once he found this goal and the Sharks got a little bit more confidence here, you saw Smith begin to simplify a little bit, still looking for those great passes, but actually being willing to shoot more, and that led to Smith having a very positive game here. So I was impressed with both Celebrini and Smith. When it comes to Tyler Toffoli, still the general feeling of him being a little bit of a third wheel on this line. Like, he had a pretty decent play on this goal that was eventually there for Will Smith. So it's not as though he's a complete dead weight or anything on this trio, but you do kind of have to continue to wonder, what this group of players, what Celebrini and Smith could do with someone who could maybe keep up with them a little bit more. If Eklund were on this top line, would this be a trio that just absolutely dominated game after game after game? It's hard to say, but it's certainly possible with how well Celebrini is playing and how solid that Smith looks as well. Right now, Toffoli is kind of struggling to keep up with those two, and so since the lines were so great here tonight against Los Angeles, nothing is actually going to change on this front in the imminent future. By the following game, I imagine Toffoli 99% chance outside of injury that he is still with Celebrini and Smith for the next one. But I wonder if at some point down the line they could go for a little bit of a different look, because Toffoli feels as though he's maybe, he wasn't all that fast before, but maybe he's lost a little bit of a step here this season. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, this is something that we have been waiting for from this second line for the entire year. It really hasn't managed to do much when it was Eklund, Wenberg, and Toffoli, when it was Eklund, Wenberg, and Skinner. Through multiple different iterations, it really hasn't been doing much of anything. Now, this is actually despite Eklund usually managing to put up good games, but he was just not able to shine enough to make up for the 2 other players who were not really doing much of anything. And that was until tonight, where finally the second line did shine. It was the best line for the Sharks by far, and that was reflected in the ice time, where they played a ton of minutes in this game. And it once again does start with William Eklund, who had his best game of the season, despite the fact that on that road trip he was piling up the point totals, and here tonight he just has the secondary assist, if I'm not mistaken, on that Kurashev goal. He was still absolutely fantastic in this game. His work along the boards, his work in the offensive zone was nothing short of superb, and perhaps even was the Sharks' best player in general on the night. And that is that's despite the fact that there were so many really good performances here in this game. That's why it was so great to see what Eklund was actually able to do and finally being able to kind of drive this second line forward. Now, it was hard to do that alone. Obviously, somebody else needed to step up, and that was actually Philip Kurashev. Now, we haven't really seen much from Kurashev this season. He was tried on the first line. That was a failed experiment. He's played on the third line. Didn't really do much. We've seen him even be a healthy scratch a couple of games, but he finds himself on this second line with Eklund and Wenberg, and it finally does click. Like, we saw him have a decent pass to Eklund in the previous game against Minnesota, but outside of that, he didn't really do much. But here in this game, he also was just all over the ice. By far his best game as a San Jose Shark, looking really, really sharp, really solid, making some great plays. And so you really are a big fan now, at least tonight. Brief moment, we'll see how this continues, but you are a fan of how this duo ended up looking. And then when it comes to Alex Wenberg, have been quite harsh with this player as of late, talking about the lack of offense that has been coming from him. Well, he does make up for that here tonight. The great pass on the Kurashev goal, and then scores a goal for himself as well. These are two even strength goals, even if the Wenberg one was just barely as a power play did expire. And so Wenberg certainly does a good bit in this game. I also thought his defensive game was also rather solid. You can look at the mistake that he made back in the first period where he looks for like a kind of a bad pass over to Timothy Liljegren, doesn't reach him, and then Liljegren ends up taking a penalty to make up for this. Like, that was obviously a rough start to the game, but Wenberg very clearly zoomed back from that and ended up, as I said, making up the best line for the Sharks in this one. Then we get to the Sharks' third line. Here we have Graf with Misa and Skinner, so because there is no Gaudette here, Skinner ends up taking this place. But I want to focus more so onto Michael Misa here tonight. I have been talking at length in pretty much every game that he has played thus far, and including some games that he has been a healthy scratch in, about how Misa should be given more ice time. And the result here tonight is that Misa once again has pretty much a team low 10 minutes and 10 seconds. In terms of even strength ice time, he is actually tied with Ryan Reeves at just barely over 7 minutes. At the very least, in terms of total ice time, his 10 minutes 10 seconds is slightly above Ryan Reeves, but still very much near the bottom of the list here for the San Jose Sharks. And this is despite the fact that Michael Misa puts up 8 shots in this game. This is more than double anybody else on this Sharks roster in this game, or it is at least double everybody else on the Sharks roster. 8 shots in just 10 minutes of ice time is actually absurd levels of efficiency when it comes to shots on goal. Michael Misa, when he is on the ice, he has been making a pretty significant impact. We saw him have a really, really close call there where he tries to go kind of far side on Kemper, but just can't get it quite far enough. We saw him have a great chance in front of the net, I think back in like the first period as well. Like, he is getting good opportunities. Michael Misa is playing well, and yet the Sharks constantly refusing to actually give him more ice time. And I have talked in the past about how Macklin Celebrini's presence on this team has had somewhat of an adverse effect on our perspective on how certain young players look. Like, you look at a guy like Misa and Dickinson this season, or Will Smith last year, and you can't help but compare them to Celebrini, who has been so incredibly impressive that all of the other young guys kind of look worse by comparison. But the thing is that Celebrini is the outlier. He is the exception to the rule that most teenagers coming into the NHL are not really going to have an easy time, and they're going to have some bumps, and they're not going to play all that well. Celebrini is that kind of outlier here who is just absolutely flying. And this is a mistake that us fans can fall into, but this is seemingly a mistake that Ryan Warsofsky himself is also falling into here, because it is absolutely the case that Misa has not come into this season and just exploded on the scene, and he's got that crazy explosiveness in his skating, and he's carrying pucks into the zone single-handedly, and he's making plays, and he's looking as fantastic as Celebrini did in his first season. That is true, but Misa has quietly put up solid performances in almost every single game that he has played. The only one that stands out as like a slightly below average performance was his outing against Carolina, which was literally his first NHL game of his entire career. Since then, he has been above average, if not quite good, in every single other game. And the 8 shots here tonight is just the cherry on top. And yet, because he is lacking this flashiness in his game, seemingly Ryan Warsofsky has him very far down on the list of priority here. He is constantly missing shifts. We have seen multiple times just in this game, and previously it had also been happening, but in this game we saw Graf and Skinner take a shift with like Dellandrea, or with Barclay Goodrow, or with Alex Wenberg, as Misa is skipped over time and time again. And it'd be one thing if he was this massive liability in his own zone, like he was a complete disaster, or he was like Will Smith, where he's just not really prioritizing that area of his game. But Misa has been remarkably solid, at least by 18-year-old standards, in his own zone. Like, he's looked rather good. Like, if you look at a guy like Macklin Celebrini, a lot is said about his kind of two-way style because he does have the tools to be extremely effective as a defensive forward, and indeed when the puck is in his vicinity, his ability to win puck battles and his tenaciousness, it is extremely, extremely valuable. But if you go back to that first season, in moments where he's kind of being forced to have to play more of a zone defense and he's kind of having to read the defensive play, that's where he has actually struggled, and that is something that Misa has actually impressed me with thus far this season. Sure, he's not killing plays, so he's not like an elite defensive forward, far from it, but he has usually been rather positionally sound, and so you would think that Misa wouldn't necessarily be this massive liability on the ice that the Sharks would have to avoid going with through the defensive zone. His face-off percentage here tonight wasn't very good, but over the season thus far it has been pretty solid, and so it is strange to see that he is constantly looked over despite the fact that he is putting up good performances time and time again. And one has to wonder if, again, the Macklin Celebrini effect is there, that because he's not so flashy and so outshining everybody else, that he is easily looked over in favor of other veteran guys. That is definitely an unfortunate situation in my eyes, because Misa, as that second overall pick, you feel as though there is more here, and the Sharks are just not giving him that opportunity. When it comes to his two line mates, Graf and Skinner, this was definitely a trio that couldn't quite capture the same magic and the same chemistry as the Graf-Misa-Gaudette of the previous few games. Graf, I thought, was unusually quiet in this game. Like, it was still an alright performance from him, but I have seen better, especially over this past road trip. And then Skinner, great play on the Wenberg goal. This was on the power play that was expiring, so this wasn't necessarily with Misa and Graf on the ice. But it wasn't necessarily like an outstanding game from Skinner. Again, like Graf, pretty good, but nothing amazing. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Goodrow, Dellandrea, and Reeves. There was some good and some bad here tonight for this trio of players. They had some solid offensive zone shifts where they didn't have many close calls necessarily, but getting shots on net, getting some chances in that area. And as we saw in the previous game, you send the puck on the net and sometimes it just deflects off of Ryan Reeves' shin and goes in. So why not try in those situations? So it was positive in that area, but there were a couple of times where this trio was caught in the defensive zone, and that's where in particular a guy like Reeves might look a little bit more rough, but it all ended up working out in the end. I would still say slightly more positive than negative for this fourth line. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, we have the top pairing of Orlov and Liljegren. Unsurprising that these two are kept together, and I thought they actually had a very good game. Dmitry Orlov, he didn't necessarily make a ton happen from an offensive perspective, though I'll get to that a little bit later, but I think he was mostly quite solid throughout the night. The same would go for Liljegren. Yes, he ended up taking that penalty early on, but that was mostly Alex Wenberg's fault, and then I didn't really like his read on this Brandt Clark play. That one was really unfortunate. But all in all, still a relatively positive night, I would say, for Liljegren and Orlov. Then we get to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, and this is where we have a very interesting player. That is John Klingberg, who returns to the lineup here for the first time in a couple of weeks. His last game was against the Carolina Hurricanes. He was terrible in that game, and it's not as though he was healthy scratched. Since then, he was actually injured. Unsurprising, because Klingberg seems to be injured half the time, but he does return here tonight. And the big thing was, and I tweeted about this near the beginning of the game, was that Klingberg immediately regained his spot on the Sharks' top power play unit, and I was very confused about this situation because the Sharks' top power play unit has been extremely effective in each of these last few games. They scored 2 power play goals on just 2 attempts. Last game against Minnesota, they had a power play goal against the New Jersey Devils. They had a power play goal against the New York Rangers. Like, it has been clicking rather well, and it is not a fundamentally incorrect choice to make a swap in that type of case. For instance, if Celebrini had been injured and they were running with Alex Wenberg in this spot and they were doing well, like, obviously once Celebrini returns from that injury, you put him on that top unit anyway because he's very clearly your best player and he does improve that that unit's odds of actually scoring. But that is far from the case here for John Klingberg. Like, it's not as though he asserted himself quite clearly as the Sharks' top power play guy in those first 3 games of the season. Like, it should not necessarily be etched in stone that he needs to be playing in this spot. And Dmitry Orlov had been doing rather well in this role. If I'm Orlov, I'm looking at my 8 points on the year, which is actually amongst the league leaders in terms of defensive scoring, and I'm looking at the type of impact that I'm making on the power play, and I'm kind of wondering why John Klingberg immediately takes my spot on the top power play unit, despite the fact that not only has he missed 6 games in a row, but even when he was playing, he was very bad in 2 of the 3 games. Like, it just doesn't really make much logical sense to me that this is the decision that they decide to make. And lo and behold, the Sharks go 0 for 5 on the power play here tonight, including a good minute and a half or so of 6-on-4 power play time near the end of the game with the goaltender pulled. Yes, Wenberg does score, and this is power play influenced, and so you could say they're sort of 1 for 5, but even then, that's the Sharks' second power play unit where Orlov was literally on the ice. The top unit for the Sharks, featuring Klingberg, goes 0 for 5, and that's not necessarily Klingberg's fault, but you wonder if maybe Orlov was here, could that have made the difference? Could that have gotten the Sharks at least 1 extra goal, which would have been huge in this game? Perhaps, perhaps not. We'll never know, but it's just really, really strange that Warsofsky decides to make this quick swap. It just doesn't really make any amount of sense to me. The one logical explanation, I guess, is that the Sharks are trying to inflate the value of John Klingberg because they are planning on trying to still flip him at the deadline, but like, is that really a real possibility with the types of efforts that he has been putting up from a defensive standpoint? And even so, like, is this worth losing games in a season that the Sharks have said that they're trying to win games in? I don't think so. But in the end, when it comes to his actual even strength play here tonight for John Klingberg, kind of an up and down game. I thought his second period, he was actually very good. I was impressed with his middle frame. To be fair, pretty much every single San Jose Shark player was very good in the second period, but Klingberg at the very least was a part of that. However, in the first, a little bit shaky. In the third period, also a little bit shaky. It was not a terrible game, but it kind of reminded me of the first one he had against the Vegas Golden Knights, the type of like 4 on 10 performance, which is like not completely terrible, but clearly not all that great either. When it comes to Mario Ferraro, his defensive partner here tonight, I actually thought Ferraro was okay. Nothing super impressive, but all around a decent outing for him. He did have a couple of all right plays. There was one moment, I think it was him, if I'm not mistaken, in front of the net where he was able to tie up a Kings player's stick, which would have otherwise been a very great chance, if not an easy goal for them. So that was nice to see from Ferraro, something that we really haven't seen a ton of great net front play from Sharks defensemen thus far this season. So that was a big moment, and generally I thought Ferraro looked all right. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we'll start off with Sam Dickinson. Obviously, he was coming off of a pretty rough outing the other night against the Minnesota Wild, and so I was interested to see how he would do with another matchup here against a pretty good team, or supposedly pretty good team, like the Los Angeles Kings. Dickinson, kind of like Klingberg, also had a pretty up and down night. It started off with his move on this Corey Perry goal. Now, I won't put this entirely on him, because we see the Sharks, they kind of overcommit to one side of the ice trying to clear this out, and they failed to do so, which puts Dickinson in a little bit of a tough spot. But with Dellandrea seemingly being able to cut across and be able to prevent Clark from doing too much in this situation, you likely would have liked to see Dickinson hang back a little bit and stay much closer to Corey Perry, who's just hanging out besides the net as he always does. But instead, Dickinson comes out to challenge. Clark goes for the pass. It is deflected off the stick of Colin Graff, and then it goes off the post and everything like that, but it still was probably the incorrect read from Sam Dickinson, and as such, he actually ends up getting benched for the rest of this first period. That kind of further proves my point that I usually make in previous videos where I talk about how like a veteran player, like for instance Ferraro, I didn't even bring this up, Ferraro makes the error that actually leads to this 2-on-1 for the Kings that makes it 2-0 early on in the second period. He does not miss a shift after this, but then Sam Dickinson makes a mistake and, well, he gets benched for the rest of the period. That's how it goes for these younger players. However, once he came back, in the second period and started to get slightly more consistent shifts, because in the end he only played about 12 minutes of ice time here tonight. I actually thought he settled in a good bit, made some decent plays, helped out offensively at least a little bit, and all in all, it was an alright game for Sam Dickinson, maybe like a 5-on-10, 6-on-10 type of performance. The big thing for Dickinson to mention right now is that the deadline for making a decision here of whether or not he remains in the NHL is coming up very, very soon. This was his 8th game of the season, which means he has one more. If he plays on Thursday, that would be his 9th game, which means we would probably hear about the decision of whether or not to keep him around or send him down on the Friday on Halloween. And I would say at this point, Dickinson should absolutely stick around. I don't think he has much left to learn in the OHL, and so the only reason I was originally thinking that he would go back is if he was just a complete liability in every single game that he played. Like if he had put up performances like he did against Carolina in all 9 games, you probably couldn't justify keeping him up in the NHL, but he has been much more solid than not in most of these games, and so to me, there's no reason to send him back down, and in fact, I would be pretty upset if that were to occur. When it comes to his defensive partner, Vincent Desharnais, I thought Desharnais did recover at least a bit from these last couple of games. Didn't have the greatest outings against New Jersey or Minnesota, but here in this one, I thought Desharnais was all right. And then finally we get to the Sharks goaltender, probably the most controversial player of the night, unsurprisingly, because you look on the kind of surface here on the scoreboard, the Sharks give up 4 goals, but only on, I believe, 14 shots. That's never going to look good for the goaltender. But actually, up until it was about 3-0, I didn't really have too many problems with Askarov. This first goal from Corey Perry, he basically has 0 chance on because, again, nobody's in front covering Corey Perry, who has literally made his living for 20 years in the NHL being in this exact position, so he's not going to miss too often in that spot. That was the one that made it 1-0. The 2-0 goal, it's a 2-on-1, so it's hard to put a ton of blame on the goalie. Yes, you probably would have liked him play this a little bit better than he actually did, but I didn't have a huge major issue with that. And then on this Doughty goal, it didn't look great at first, but I believe it did deflect off of Mario Ferraro, if I'm not mistaken, or at the very least it passed extremely close to him and grazed his jersey, because there was some movement there. So on a tip-in type of goal like that, I also don't have a major problem. The thing was that once this game got tied up at 3, you needed Askarov to be able to come up big for you, and he did on 1, right? I mentioned earlier on he had that great save on Kempe, but then you look at this Brandt Clark shot, and yes, it's a great shot, but you want to see a save be made there. You look on the other side of the ice, Darcy Kemper, he lets in 3 goals, but most of these he had absolutely no chance on. In fact, all of these I would say he had absolutely no chance on. And then you watch him in particular in those final few minutes of the game, how many insane saves he is making on great shots from players like Celebrini or Toffoli or Smith in all of these different situations. He's got them, robbing them constantly left and right. And then you look at Askarov, who lets in this shot from Clark. Again, it's a good shot, but still, you're a little bit disappointed with how this game ends from him. And so, not really a good outing from Askarov. He has been playing back-to-back and now back-to-back games. He had played against New Jersey and Minnesota, and so Warsofsky was trying to get him rolling a little bit here, ride the hot hand, because he had played well, but this is the type of outing that you're going to be a little bit disappointed with how the goalie looked. He is definitely going to sit out for the next one. I imagine Delkovich does play on Thursday, and then the Sharks have another back-to-back Saturday-Sunday. We'll see them split, and hopefully Askarov can redeem himself a little bit, because while I won't put the entirety of the fault of this game onto him, he certainly didn't help out the cause all that much, and he's quite high up on the list of people to blame. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. We'll be taking on the New Jersey Devils again, so the Sharks will very quickly be getting rid of their Devils matchup this season. Both games happening in October. The previous one, just a few days ago, the Sharks lost 3-1. Pretty well played game, however, for San Jose, now being the home team and hopefully being able to follow up on this really good outing against the Kings. We'll see if they're able to pick up the win. Class dismissed.